I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Tracy Ippolito. I am part of the Florida Brace project, which is a CDC-funded project. BRACE stands for Building Resilience Against Climate Effects. And the BRACE program is basically working to improve the ability of the public health sector to respond to health effects that are related to climate variability. And this is done by incorporating the best available climate science into routine public health practice. So this presentation today will cover basic evaluation concepts. It will give an in-depth dive into the planning that can or at least should go into evaluation efforts, as well as a practical application of evaluation planning using a climate and health intervention example. Before we get started, several people have asked if this webinar will be recorded, and yes, we will record it and post it to the Florida Brace website, which is www.flbrace.org, hopefully no later than tomorrow. I think that's it for me. Our presenters now are Drs. Tisha Holmes and Ava Holt, who are both members of the Florida Brace team. And with that, I will say take it away, Drs. Holmes and Holt.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Tisha Holmes, and I'm co-presenting with Ava Holt. And as Tracy said, we're the evaluation leads on the Florida Brace team, and we welcome you to our webinar on an introduction to evaluation. As Tracy also said, the Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program is a CDC-sponsored initiative across 16 states and 2 cities to support public health preparedness and adaptation to the current and potential impacts of climate change. So this year, Florida Brace is embarking on a new round of funding for projects with a focus on evaluation of the process and/or outcomes associated with ongoing or new projects which address climate change. Evaluation planning is a complex process that can take several months to even years. And we are attempting to condense major concepts into a 1-hour webinar. So if it seems overwhelming today, that's okay, don't be discouraged. The purpose of this webinar is really to highlight the different components to get you started on this journey. This webinar was developed to support the funding opportunity announcement presently in circulation to public health departments and your community partners. You should have received an email regarding the details and deadlines to obtain funding. If you haven't, please reach out to us and we'll get the pertinent information to you. The funding opportunity focuses on evaluations of adaptations, of interventions, or other evidence-based projects that will further the implementation of the BRACE framework in Florida. And these proposals are due on February 21st, 2018. Evaluation is really an important component of program development, but it's often an afterthought or neglected when an agency has more pressing priorities. And we're focusing on building capacities of public health departments to get you to start thinking about evaluation before embarking on the project. A comprehensive evaluation can help track whether projects are meeting the intended goals and objectives, whether projects are successful, and what course corrections may be needed. So today we're going to get into what is evaluation, why it's important, and when evaluation should be done. We'll then look at the evaluation life cycle and focus on the planning process. Then we'll apply what we learned today with an example and round out our discussion with potential challenges and highlight the components we would like to see in an evaluation plan. To get started, what comes to mind when you hear the word evaluation? Does the thought of an evaluation make you feel stressed because you're unsure of its applications, or you simply don't know much about it? Well, there are many available definitions of evaluation. One definition is the systematic collection of information about the activities, characteristics, and outcomes of programs used to make judgments about the program, improve program effectiveness, and/or to inform decisions about future program development. For our funding opportunity, evaluation will mean the structured process of assessing the success of adaptations, such as heat advisories or outreach or the utility of new tools, in meeting their goals, as well as the reflection on lessons learned from those adaptations. Now, the CDC provides us with an additional definition of evaluation, which is much more focused on public health, and that includes quality standards to guide our work. Evaluation is a systematic way to improve and account for public health actions by involving procedures that are useful, feasible, ethical, and accurate. This illustration summarizes the 6 steps presented in the CDC framework for program evaluation, which are shown in a circle representing the continuous process of evaluation. And at the center of the circle are the evaluation standards. Now, these 4 standards are used to maximize the quality and the effectiveness of the evaluation. They are applicable to each of the 6 steps in the evaluation framework. So why should we evaluate interventions, programs, or policies? Well, first, the primary purpose of an evaluation is to provide the evidence or data about an intervention's movement towards achieving its expected outcomes. Also, evaluations answer questions concerning program or intervention characteristics. For example, is there a justification for continuing to implement this intervention? Was it implemented as planned, or were there barriers? And what's the time frame of the intervention? We also evaluate to assess an intervention's impact on different population groups or its influence in differing communities. For example, did the intervention have a greater impact because the intervention reached more people over a shorter time frame? Evaluations may be focused on the cost of the intervention and its relationship to the benefits. An example question could be, what were the costs of implementing this intervention or adaptation? What cost savings did this intervention provide its participants? And finally, in an evaluation, one may analyze the value or usefulness of an intervention. And value will depend on the community or population group receiving the intervention. An evaluation question may include, does the intervention provide the most benefits with the provided resources? So among the many reasons to evaluate, there are 4 basic reasons. The first one is to gain knowledge. By evaluating a program, we can judge its value or gain knowledge about the program and its processes. Now, this might include providing information about a new intervention and to find out where you are in the process and where you're going. It provides us with information for better decision making and also allows us to manage resources and services more effectively. A second reason would be to make improvements. We conduct evaluations in order to make improvements or change processes. It provides information about what is missing and where to focus our efforts. An evaluation also provides us with a way to understand why we achieved our successes or why objectives weren't met. Both provide valuable and useful information. A third reason is to measure effectiveness. Evaluations help us see how well objectives and goals are being met. Evaluation findings can show if the intervention was effective in achieving the intended changes or effects. And finally, to build capacity. We use evaluation for building program capacity. The process is effective for programs to make changes, such as to increase funding, develop skills, build infrastructure, or strengthen accountability. For example, an evaluation of an educational outreach intervention to educate seniors about heat stress in a community of immigrants. Findings from that evaluation may show a need to translate informational materials into a new language to build capacity to serve this community. Also, this effort could result in the development of new partnerships. And finally, evaluation can strengthen accountability by demonstrating to funders that we're responsible in the use of funding and resources. Now we know the definition of an evaluation and why it's used. You're probably curious as to when an evaluation should be conducted. Traditionally, most evaluations occurred after a program ended or as an afterthought of an intervention when it's too late to make improvements or changes. Therefore, the stage of a program or intervention influences the reason for the evaluation. So to be most effective and beneficial and useful, an evaluation can be done at all phases of the life cycle of a program or intervention. New or young programs can use evaluation to pilot different versions of itself on different target audiences, and thereby avoiding scaling up potentially ineffective activities. Established programs can use evaluation to justify continued funding to a funder who needs to know why they should continue supporting a particular cause or organization. And programs which have a natural end or are very mature can use evaluation to determine longer-term impacts, such as reductions in morbidity and mortality, which are often out of the scope for new or even established programs. Now, let's consider in more depth what's called the evaluation life cycle, which shows us how evaluation planning fits into the larger life cycle of evaluation. This life cycle is made of 3 stages: planning, implementing, and utilizing. Now, the planning activities are those which help us figure out what the thing is we are evaluating, what we want to know about it, and how we will answer our evaluation questions. This is also the stage which produces an evaluation or a monitoring plan of some kind. Implementing activities are those which occur after planning of some kind has taken place and include the collection, analysis, and interpretation of evaluation data. It's also the stage where databases, monitoring reports, and evaluation reports or products are created. And finally, utilization is the use of those findings to make changes to your evaluated program, project, policy, or intervention. And at any given time, evaluators and stakeholders may be engaging in one of these stages or all 3 simultaneously for different projects. Now let's consider CDC's evaluation framework alongside the life cycle, which consists of 6 steps that can guide us through all life cycle stages in a methodical, comprehensive, and systematic way. Steps 1 through 3 of the framework: engaging stakeholders, describing the program, and focusing evaluation design are all relevant to planning. Steps 1, 4, and 5, engaging stakeholders, gathering credible evidence, and justifying conclusions, are about implementing. And steps 1 and 5, engaging stakeholders and ensuring use and lessons learned, aligns with the utilization stage. You'll note engaging stakeholders is the only step which should be occurring at every stage of the life cycle. Now, for the rest of the webinar, we will only be focusing on the planning stage. The planning stage is made of 3 very big and often time-consuming activities or steps: engaging stakeholders, describing the program, and focusing the evaluation design. Although these 3 steps are listed chronologically in the CDC framework, it's not been my experience that they happen that way, or even that it's best that they do. In fact, sometimes one might need to start down the road of describing the program or drawing up the logic model, which is a diagram which maps the inputs and activities needed to conduct a program or project to outputs and anticipated outcomes, to even begin to identify who could be a stakeholder. Or many times a final logic model is not completed until all pieces of an evaluation plan have been drafted. So let's start with engaging stakeholders. Engaging stakeholders during the planning phase of evaluation is really about getting critical people who are involved in the program, the project, the policy, or the intervention to also be involved in the evaluation planning activities. Once this group has been identified and analyzed as to their interests and roles in the evaluation, the evaluator or the evaluation team can better establish who will need to be engaged for which remaining evaluation planning activities and decisions moving forward. And the major output of this effort is typically documented in a stakeholder engagement table of some kind in the evaluation plan. However, all evaluation planning outputs, the logic model, evaluation questions, and methods should be developed with input of the stakeholders. Now, here are some basic tables you can use to take that initial step of figuring out who should count as a stakeholder. Though we won't go over these tables in detail now, they're designed when completed either individually or together to help the evaluators identify all relevant stakeholders to the evaluation effort. And often when I need to start figuring out who should be even considered a stakeholder or who to invite to a meeting, I'll fill these out first. Once you have a list of identified stakeholders, it's time to analyze them a bit more and really dig in and figure out what makes them tick. There are many tools for doing just that, some involving the stakeholders analyzing themselves, or some the evaluator can do at their desk. The tools here on the slide are but a few of the analysis techniques evaluators can use to better understand their stakeholders and better orient evaluation planning activities to the most relevant people. And links for these items are also available on our website. Meeting with stakeholders can happen as a way to analyze them and also as a way to involve them in the rest of the evaluation planning stage. Meetings might be organized around, for example, developing a logic model, developing evaluation questions, or evaluation methods. The links provided in this slide reference meeting techniques or processes that depart a bit from the traditional meeting, but are also commonly used in evaluation, and I wanted you to be aware of them. Though we won't review these in detail, we provided a bit of information about when it's best to use each, and the links included provide guidance about putting these into play. We've often found that meetings can be the lifeblood of evaluation, and the more interesting they are, the more investment in the evaluation you get with stakeholders. Describing the program is another major step of evaluation planning and involves identifying and documenting all the nuts and bolts of a program, project, policy, or intervention, as well as the surrounding context or systems where the program, project, policy, or intervention are taking place. Oftentimes, stakeholders will convene several discussions or meetings around answering some of the most basic questions, like what exactly do we do? How do we do it? What are the effects? One common observation during these discussions is how often stakeholders assume each other has the same idea or understanding of a program. And these discussions can unearth a lot of discrepancies between different program components and can act like a small intervention and tie up loose ends or streamline different team processes. So as you begin articulating these things with the help of a log frame or outcome mapping or theories of change or other methodologies, various components of the evaluation plan can get created, such as the need, the context, and the logic model. And finally, focusing the evaluation is what happens as more concrete interpretations of the program, project, policy, or intervention are developed. It's through these activities that an evaluator or evaluating team figures out the scope of the evaluation and what components of the program, project, policy, or intervention are able to be evaluated and will yield the most timely and useful information. And oftentimes, this is where knowing the content and stage of the development of a program, project, policy, or intervention can be very helpful. For example, if my program is brand new, I may only be able to evaluate a few process measures and 1 or 2 short-term outcomes. However, if my program has been around a long time, I may be looking at doing an impact evaluation. Just like the other planning activities, we provided some links to resources that can assist you in working through steps of focusing your evaluation. There are many out there, of course. If you have others you can use for this step in evaluation planning, please don't feel you need to review just these because they're listed. And now at this time, Ava Holt will walk you through an example of developing an evaluation plan.
Good afternoon. Now we'll review the purpose and use some tools of evaluation planning by using an example of a vector control intervention. So let's start with the case of Lyme disease and tick-borne illness prevention efforts. Every summer, the county health department sends out this email that I've screenshotted into our slide. This email contains links to various tools that schools can use to teach during school activities or provide to parents to better interrupt the vector exposure pathway. We know the email was essentially a once-a-year email sent to school administrators that contained information for several audiences and uses within the school system about tools they can use to teach others about tick-borne prevention. And we know this intervention needs an evaluation plan. So now what? Just to show you quickly how one can start approaching these initial steps, here's a picture of what you can do. Print the relevant information and make notes everywhere. Write questions, circle things, make comments. But the idea is to get a general sense of what the thing is that we need to evaluate. Next, try to identify some stakeholders for the intervention using one of our simple stakeholder identification tools. To save time, I've already created this table, which I will go through with you. On the next slide, we will start working through these tools together. So first, I needed to figure out who's involved in the intervention or was implementing it. I saw that the Department of Health was explicitly mentioned in the email, so I wrote them down. By clicking on the links in the email, I also saw that CDC was mentioned as well as the Tick Encounter Resource Center at the State University. So I added both as well. Since no one else from the program side was identified in the email, I thought a little more about the intervention. It's an email or communications material. So likely communications people or some kind was probably involved. Also, because the intervention is housed on different web pages and asked the reader to visit and use several web pages, I concluded that a web developer or someone involved with maintaining web pages was involved. Then I moved to the next question. Luckily, the audiences affected by the intervention are spelled out clearly in the email. School administrators, their staff, as well as the children enrolled at their schools and their parents are being targeted in different ways by this email, and it's linked to tools. Finally, I figured all department staff, the CDC Climate and Health Program, staff from the Tick Encounter Center, all targeted school administrators, as well as prevention practitioners around the country might be interested in the efficacy of this intervention. Obviously, we have taken some liberties with this table, but the idea is when we've been able to take one document pertaining to this intervention, the email, and perform some stakeholder identification. So now we need to analyze our list of stakeholders. Think a little more carefully about what their relationship is to this intervention. What component or components of the intervention matter most to the stakeholders? For the climate change program manager, changes in the number of ticks found on kids during school hours. Or if school staff and parents reading through the tools understand the content and intend to use the tools. For the communications lead, usability and navigability linked to web pages. For the web developer, changes in the number of ticks found on kids during school hours. For school administrators, how kids' behaviors changed after using the kit in class. And for school families, if their peers are using the tools. And while we don't have time to simulate meeting with stakeholders right now, I'd like to pose to the group, if this were your list of stakeholders for this intervention, think about how might you begin engaging them at this early stage of evaluation planning. Next, we will begin working on our logic model by answering some basic questions about the email contents. One of the first questions which will help us compose the activity section of the logic model is, what is this intervention made of? The intervention, as I read it, is really made of 3 tools. Number 1, the Lyme Disease Prevention Toolkit, which you must click on the top right link for the information. Next, there is the TickSmart PowerPoint presentation, which you would have to email the Department of Health to gain access. And finally, the TickSmart Education Kit. Next, I often try to figure out who is doing what work for a program or intervention to be fully implemented, which can help me understand how the program or intervention plays out from the activity side of the logic model to the outcome side. This intervention has some layers regarding implementation. How would you answer the question, who disseminates which parts of this intervention to whom? Here's how I answered the question. The DOH sends out its yearly annual email blast to the school administrators. Some of those school administrators might be those who can take the toolkits and provide them to parents and students, while others might forward it on to other school staff who will further disseminate the toolkits and their contents to parents and students. Then those staff members who receive the email from administrators will also be disseminating the toolkits to the parents or students, depending on the content of the toolkits. Finally, two of the toolkits, the Lyme Disease Prevention Toolkit and the TickSmart Kit, contain resources that are designed for parents to use themselves or pass along to their children in some way, whether that's through new knowledge or behaviors. This various chain of events needs to work for this intervention to move from the activity side of the logic model to the outcome side. Next, by having this email or the toolkit disseminated, what changes or effects do we expect will occur once recipients have received the email or its toolkit contents? We can build from the table in the last slide to talk through the process. What are the effects we'd like to see on the school administrators, their staff, parents, or children from either seeing this email or having the toolkits within disseminated to them? So I may have gone just a little bit overboard, but I tried to document everything we might want to see happen and measure from all these recipients or audiences being exposed to the email and its toolkit contents. Let's look at the first row from our table as an example. The intervention part, consisting of the full email and all toolkits, and then you have your recipients of the intervention, which are the school administrators. What effects or changes will this recipient, in our example, the school administrators, experience by being exposed to this intervention part, the full email and all toolkits? Read and understand it. Forward on to other staff who can better disseminate and use the tools. Increase knowledge of tick identification, repellent, inspection, removal avoidance, Lyme disease symptoms, and Lyme treatment. Increase protective behaviors on students' behavior by helping them avoid tick-prone areas, applying proper repellent to students, accurately identifying ticks on students, accurately inspecting for and removing ticks found on students' bodies, accurately identifying and communicating to proper channels about Lyme symptoms identified on students. Develop school policies aimed at reducing tick exposure. Now, we will start trying to build our logic model. Skipping the input section for right now, let's start with the activities and output columns. Given what we have talked through about this intervention thus far, we identified some of the activities and outputs you would document for this intervention. For example, our first activity, listed in our first row, is updating informational email or tick prevention resources. The output or result from doing the activity is an updated informational email. Like the previous slide, let's use our thought work on the question, what effects will these recipients experience by being exposed to this intervention? To begin categorizing short-term versus intermediate outcomes, we can take from this table I put together or from our discussion just a minute ago to list some short-term and intermediate outcomes. For example, one of the short-term outcomes from the intervention is that school administrators and their staff will read the email. An intermediate outcome is students increase knowledge on tick safety, protection, identification, repellent, inspection, removal, avoidance, and Lyme disease symptoms. And now we can use the same example to answer what are the long-term outcomes and final health impacts. In our example, one of the long-term outcomes is school administrators develop and enforce policies aimed at decreasing student tick exposure. As part of the long-term goal of the intervention, the health impact is the incidence of Lyme disease in students decrease during the summer. Using the information I collected, not including the information under the input section, I assembled this table version of the intervention. Take a moment to see how we wrote down all of the information gathered from the activities, outputs, and outcomes. And then we will look at it in figure form. While this is my logic model draft, once an evaluator and their team or stakeholders have reached this point, even if the logic model is just a draft, it is usually much easier to begin thinking about focusing the evaluation design. If you were to start trying to figure out which pieces of this intervention to start evaluating, what are some questions you might ask yourself or your stakeholders to figure out what makes the most sense for the evaluation? What are the inputs needed to proceed with the defined activities and the outputs you expect to develop from these activities? What are the short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes? And finally, what are the expected and intended impacts? These are some questions that can get you and your stakeholders started in figuring out what part of your program, project, policy, or intervention you should enter into the evaluation lifecycle. In this section, I want to quickly review some of the common issues that can arise while trying to make those revolutions around the evaluation lifecycle so that you might better be able to identify when they are happening, which is often the stage where evaluation problems can be prevented. From a resource perspective, there may be time and funding constraints, which limit the extent of evaluation that can take place. Some departments may also have limited training or experience with conducting evaluations. Evaluating a program that has already been in existence can be challenging. For instance, leadership decides the program needs to figure out the impact it has had. So evaluators start by trying to connect with stakeholders who can give the full picture of the program. But many people have moved or retired. Current staff have been working with the program a few years, and they don't know the program from its early stages. Then it is discovered through document review that at some point the program drastically changed its activities. Therefore, the evaluation plan may require 2 logic models, and evaluators may have to measure twice as many processes and outcome indicators. Much of that data was never collected because no one was anticipating evaluating this program. Thus, this is the too little, too late issue. Another barrier is data not connected to any evaluation or monitoring plan, or even simply an evaluation question. In other words, orphan data collected that is disconnected from program goals or needs and is ignored once collected. I also call this the way it has always been done phenomenon, whereas it's assumed that if something has been done for a long time, it must have merit. Then there is the quick and dirty request, often made of evaluators to figure out somehow how to quickly move through the planning, implementation, and utilization stages under some deadlines, and often leads to a disjointed and unhelpful evaluation. There are many more examples, and I am sure you all could think of many more. Finally, I want to provide you with an example guidance document outlining evaluation plan components. This is a snapshot of an evaluation plan worksheet that may be used to help guide your efforts in evaluation planning. Each step provides the components of the evaluation plan we will need for the final deliverables outlined in the Florida Brace funding opportunity. Please feel free to use other guidance documents as a resource, but this one should get you started. We at Florida Brace are here to support you and serve as a resource to assist you through the development of the evaluation plan. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us as you go through the process with questions. Today, we have covered the basics of the evaluation life cycle, and evaluation planning components using an example. When evaluation is planned thoroughly with attention paid to how the whole life cycle needs to be engaged, the implementation and utilization stages run like a well-oiled machine. Pieces fall into place and function as intended. At this time, I would like to turn over the conclusion of our webinar to Tracy Ippolito.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Holmes and Dr. Holt. Before we close up, I would like to call your attention to our funding opportunity, which is sort of how this idea got started about doing an evaluation webinar. Although what we did, as you can see, was we really just tried to give a nuts and bolts about what evaluation and evaluation planning is. But that said, yes, there is a funding opportunity. So if you go to our website at the URL up there, which you all should have, and I will also make sure it's on the homepage of our website, you can find out information about the different components that will be needed for a proposal should you want to apply. A copy of the funding opportunity, as well as a recording of this webinar, links and additional resources can be found on our website. The recording's not there yet, but it will be shortly. Please review it carefully. Let us know if you have any questions as you develop a proposal. We look forward to reviewing them. And finally, I guess we've come to the end of our webinar. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank Tisha Holmes and Ava Holt and the rest of our Florida Brace team, including the Florida Brace Director, Dr. Chris Waggio, here at FSU. I'd also like to express our gratitude to Chelsea Austin and Jane Horton at the CDC for their guidance and support in developing this webinar. And I'd like to open up for questions and comments. We have a reasonably small group, and so while we were going to try to manage it via chat, which is completely fine, I think what I'm going to do is just open it up, and if you would like to ask any questions of Dr. Holt or Dr. Holmes, just go ahead and do so. So I've unmuted everybody, and if you could just identify who you are so that we know who we're listening to, and ask your question. And I can see your name so I can call on people if I have to.
Hi, this is Suzanne Grubbs. I'm with the Florida Department of Health in Volusia County. And we are getting ready to start a tree planting day at a park in Midtown. And would definitely like to evaluate that intervention for the community, but trees take a long time to grow.
Mm.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, hi, Susan. That's a very good point. And you know, we think that, as we said at the beginning of our presentation, that you are embarking on a long-term journey. Now, some projects may take some weeks to months to develop an evaluation plan and do an actual evaluation, but other projects may not. So for your specific tree planting project, we have to think about what exactly do you want to evaluate, right? Do you want to evaluate the process of developing that tree planting project and then whether or not it worked? Those are two types of evaluations that happen at two different time scales. So I guess it's to say it depends on what you want to evaluate. If you're thinking about submitting it to the funding opportunity to get some support, we welcome it, but we just have to be clear about what we intend to plan for in terms of the evaluation. And we can help. We've had conversations before. We can help you think through that process.
This is Tracy. Yeah, unfortunately, trees do take time to grow, but I think top of mind for me comes to, as a person who is challenged sometimes to bring members of the community together, you know, would there be opportunities to look at how the event was promoted and how effective that promotion was? Did you get enough attendance? Did you get buy-in from the media? Was it covered? You know, that sort of thing. I would think that, yeah, we can't know if the climate intervention itself or the health-related intervention itself is working until the trees get bigger, but perhaps looking at the effectiveness of the outreach effort. What do you think, Tisha and Ava?
Yeah, I think that's right on target. That's something that can be done in a very short time frame that's manageable and discreet enough to evaluate within the short term.
Because I'm thinking, you know, it's always a challenge to get the community out, but sometimes more so than others, and the means by which we get information out to people varies, and some is more effective than others. I know I always want to know, how'd you hear about this? You know, somebody shows up. Did you hear about it on the web? Did you hear about it on a PSA? Did you see the posting at the community center? And all of that, I think that the thing that I value most about evaluation data is that it tells me what works. And more importantly, it tells me what doesn't work, not across the board, but perhaps with a particular population. We know that if we're trying to attract folks that don't typically have access to the internet, tweeting to them and putting something on our website is not going to work. So what would work? And for me, that would be an interesting thing to look at.
I agree.
Any other questions or comments? We'd love comments as well. Okay, well, the good news is if you think of something after this webinar has ended, you can contact any of us. My email is tipolito@fsu.edu. You can find contact information for all of us on our website. There are additional details about funding opportunity, of course. And, you know, please contact any of us at any time, whether it has to do with evaluation or some other thing that might be related to the BRACE program's work, trying to help you incorporate the best available climate science into your practices. If I don't hear from anyone else that there are some burning desires, we will go ahead and wrap this up.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Susie.
Hi, Melissa.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. I will do my best to get the recording of this online by tomorrow, and I look forward to, I know we all do, hopefully some proposals for the funding
Hi,
opportunity.
Melissa, CJ. My name is going to be up at LinkedIn. You asked me to bring back something for you, and I haven't. At least I hope I have it.
I'm sorry.
Anyway, I'm stepping out my office right now, so call me later.
I'm going to go ahead and
So, you can just
thank you so much.